Ok. Bene. Bonjour. Buongiorno a tutti.
Very well. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. We are very, very pleased to open this morning this very nice discussion talk we're going to have about a very topical theme, and it's really, really a great pleasure to have so many young people among us, and we are very, very pleased that you are all here, and it gives us a sense of responsibility as well, because we need to communicate, to have a dialogue among generations, and democracy is a precious asset, but also a very fragile one, and so we have to have a talk, a dialogue among generations. This is the only way to build democracy. Let me say just a few words, because then I want to listen to our highly knowledgeable speakers who will say very interesting things. And let me say a word to explain why did we pick this theme, democracy to the test. And it's a meeting, it's a conference on peace and for peace. And there are many religious leaders attending this event. And therefore, of course, the first question that comes to mind is why talk about democracy when we are talking about peace? And what does it matter, or what does this have to do with religions? And I will say this is a challenge for this roundtable to provide answers to the questions I've just asked. And I believe that we can say from the very start that democracy, as you know, the very word is a historical word, has a lot of meanings, and it corresponds to many different political systems. We have the democracy as it was in ancient times, in modern times, as Macchiasen says, the democracy of Indian villages, the democracy of France, which is one of the most refined forms of democracy. And France was indeed the place where democracy, one of the main places where democracy was started, was generated. The modern idea of democracy was, and we also recognize the other word, that is crisis, and this issues that democracy is going through. And democracy, please allow me a quotation by Winston Churchill, democracy is the worst of political system apart from all other ones. So it has a lot of flaws, indeed, but it is indeed something that was built over time with a lot of efforts, making a lot of mistakes, but I will only focus maybe on one thing. In order to discipline power, which is a wild beast somehow that has to be tamed, and to do so avoiding violence. Forgive me for being so blunt and so short in this definition, because democracy, it's complex. It has a lot of procedures. It involves institutions, traditions, things that were not said nor written. And whatever democracy does goes along those lines, that is to say, to avoid violence. And then in the 1900s, democracy was a major ally of peace, and I hope this is going to be the case in the 21st century too, at a time in which we really need peace. So if you would like to have my answer, but we could give many more better answers as well. My answer to the question, why do we talk about democracy in a conference devoted to peace? Because imagining peace means finding pathways to reach peace. And those pathways go through democracy as well. And there's a link in this historical idea of democracy and fight against violence and peace. So there are links between all of those ideas. Democracy is ending violence, war among states, and there's a deep connection between avoiding violence among states and then finding democracy and peace. What do religions have to do with democracy? This could be another question we ask ourselves. Let's be very clear. Religions, for a very long time, were not friends with democracy. There was no easy relationship between religions and democracy, and there are still issues today. However, what I have noticed over time is that they are getting closer. I may be wrong, but I see religions are getting closer to democracy and vice versa. Why is that? Why am I saying that? Because especially when within religions what prevails is an interest for human beings, love for human beings, respect for human dignity, a sense that all human beings are brothers and sisters, as it was said many times by Pope Francis, but not only Pope Francis, and then discriminations, racism, disequalities or inequalities, and whatever democracy fights against are all things that religions in their humanitarian heart, they refuse them too. So this is a kind of convergence that I see between democracies and religions that is already ongoing, by the way, according to me. Let me say that again. They are different ideas, they're different concepts, and we move from a political ground to a religious and ideal ground, so practical and ideal. They're different, but and theoretical. But Jürgen Habermas talks about a public role religions can play. It's a kind of need democracy has. Religions are a kind of need democracy has. And this is just some food for thought, but we could say many more things. And let me wrap up by saying that religions and democracy have a common enemy, and that enemy are political religions, are ideologies that somehow support violence or have to do with violence. And religions should be afraid of being instrumentalized for the purpose of violence, and so that they are not used for violence or taken advantage of for violence, to despise the other, for exclusion, for somehow a way to destroy the living together, which is the objective of democracy, the living together of different beings, human beings. And then this is also very important for many religions who, like us, want to live together and build a world where we can all live together in peace and cooperating, working together. I do apologize for this short introduction, but now give the floor to our esteemed guests and speakers. Thank you very much for this big round of applause, and I can see attention in your eyes. Let me give the floor to Cardinal Fridolin Ambongo Bezungu. He's a cardinal and Archbishop of Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Archbishop of Kinshasa since 2018, Vice President of the Episcopal Conference of the Democratic Republic of Congo since 2017, and he took a leading role in the search for a peaceful solution to the country's ongoing political crisis. He was created a cardinal by Pope Francis in 2019, and he's absolutely committed to peace, resolutely committed to peace and justice in his country in the face of political violence and difficult electoral transitions. Thank you very much, Cardinal Fridolin. Please, the floor is yours.
Buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning, everyone.
La démocratie mise à l'épreuve,
Democracy to the test.
c'est le thème de notre atelier.
It's the theme of our meeting.
Son étymologie,
From the Greek etymology,
démos,
the term demokratia comes from demos, means people, and kratos, which means power.
démocratie est généralement définie comme
And
étant l'exercice
democracy is generally defined as the exercise of power
par le peuple
by the people, the power of the people and for the people.
dictature.
So it is formally opposed to dictatorship. Democracy entails a political regime where all of the citizens must be represented, those who take an active part in life and in public decisions of the polis. Well, certainly, despite its diversification, democracy that promotes the sovereignty of people has to be at the same time a governance system which is founded on values that make the institutions strong.
Mais pouvons-nous affirmer
But could we affirm that such democracy can live along with the
avec la
coming of strong men, with the ascent of a certain authoritarian attitude,
de la démocratie
which is the future of democracy within the framework of the political configurations of the first quarter of this 21st century?
du contexte mondial
Well, starting from the world context and then the situation of Africa specifically, we would like to demonstrate that democracy is put to the test, a very harsh test. And this is due to the ascent of authoritarianism to the detriment of systems of strong institutions.
contexte mondial et
Let us now consider the overall context in the world, and then we're going to concentrate on the current situation in Africa.
que le contexte mondial
First of all, we have to notice that the current world context is characterized by a certain instability, which is growing. And this instability is characterized by a trend on the part of international public opinion to seek simple solutions and immediate solutions to problems which are very complex.
vision à long terme.
These solutions often consist in the search for
De la figure
the figure of a strong person, a strong man, that is to say, trying to seek a kind of authority detaining full powers. Well, such a political choice is very strange, very far from slowness and difficulty in parliamentary mechanisms and electoral dynamics, which are typical of the democratic culture of both the 19th and the 20th century.
comment ce phénomène est-il perçu?
Now, how is this phenomenon perceived in Africa? We had to observe, first of all, that this worldwide context also involves the African countries, and in general, these countries already have institutional or structural weaknesses.
En convaincre de penser à ces pays africains
Well, you simply have to think of those African countries which are involved in various waves of political authoritarianism, in particular the countries of Western Africa that and also Central Africa, actually, that have gone through recently coup d'etat. So we keep talking about coup d'etat or putsch in Africa. We keep having this problem. And this landscape that destroys institutional order creates a climate of overall ill-being that questions democracy as a state-level system. And it is precisely against this trend to use coup d'etat or to change constitutions to remain in power that the former president of the United States, in his speech on the 11th July 2009 in Accra, Mr. Obama, I was saying the former president of the United States, clearly affirmed that Africa does not need strong men, but Africa needs strong institutions. Well, where are we now at this point? So in this phase of history, with the ongoing conflicts of the Third World War, fragmented, so to speak, in pieces, as Pope Francis likes to say, I think that the political program which is being pursued, the political agenda which is being pursued, is going against democratic ideals. In Africa, we have the feeling that in many countries, democracy is going backwards. Everywhere, what we are seeing is a destabilization of institutions in order to privilege the ascent of strong men. But which is the result of this attitude? What we're noticing is that conflicts and wars, more or less open, are always in Africa, of course, are always very favorable to the various coup d'etat, so authoritarian trends. One of the problems that we should not ignore by any means in this moment is the management of political authority, because less democracy means weaker institutions and less control on the handling or the management of common goods. In other words, the weakening of democratic systems paves the way to corruption that is going to bring about a gangrene in most African countries, and not only African countries. Also in other countries, this effect is produced. And this corruption that weakens whole countries often prevents the population to enjoy both the income, the yield of their own work, and financial resources of the state or public services. Let us now consider the Democratic Republic of Congo. What is the current situation? In a moment where the image of globalization is failing, democracy seems a mere product of Western culture, thus bound to failure. Well, of course, we have to recognize, we have to acknowledge that some attempts to impose democracy with strength in Africa certainly did not help the democratic cause. And it is precisely in this respect that we will be tempted in Africa to consider democracy as a Western import product or the legacy of a colonial past that need to be forgotten. Yet, I come from an African country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and after the phenomenon of Zairization, so to speak, the period of Mobutu, where Zaire was the name of the country. We wanted to go back to a democratic ideal and to cherish the name of the state. So this is what we call the Democratic Republic of Congo. But is democracy there, really? At least there is a democracy dream. So the country dreams to become fully democratic. Why this choice by Congo? Why this choice to use in its definition of democratic republic? Well, first of all, we had to say that also in the culture of our ancestors, there were some democratic contents and democratic flares. And an increasing number of anthropological studies have shown that recently in African society, the role of a village or community assemblies used to be a fundamental democratic exercise. And this was really important for the development of social life. The chief of the village did not decide by himself. So he didn't decide everything, but he was always assisted by an assembly of people from the village. Even if we cannot imagine the future of a country just considering its past, it is important to underline that drawing inspiration from the past, a past that produces a whole legacy of culture, is a reliable indication to build the future. And what we have to consider is building the future. So in order to do so, we can be inspired by what has been done by ancestors in the past. Now, the Catholic Church and the democratic process in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, the Catholic Church in the Democratic Republic of Congo has accompanied the various transition phases from the regime of the single party of the Mobutu government to the advent of democratic institutions. I'd like to briefly remind you that in 1991, my predecessor, the Cardinal Monsengo Pasigna, had taken up the direction of the Sovereign National Conference. In that very moment, all the components of the political and civil society in our country had recognized to the Catholic Church a real moral authority to accompany, to support this phase, this very critical phase, in a country that was leaving behind over 30 years of authoritarian power. After the dialogue inter-Congolese of Sun City in 2002 in South Africa, the presence as the head of the Independent and National Electoral Commission, the CENI, of Abbé Malu Malu, who represented the Catholic Church, was actually, so this presence was actually a guarantee of control and verification of the regularity of the electoral process in 2006. From 2006 to the present date, we have already had 3 or 4 elections taking place, but we have to recognize that the best election that we have never had is that of 2006. The most regular, so to speak, and the more we go on, the more the quality decreases, I had to say, unfortunately. The dissemination throughout the national territory of the Peace and Justice Commission of the CENCO made it possible to do a wonderful job, a wonderful work of education and training to democratic rights for all the population, affirming in this way that the real challenge of each truly democratic structure lies in the participation of the whole population. I would say that in a very significant and decisive manner, the Catholic Church of the Democratic Republic of Congo started to promote a democratic evolution that, unfortunately, is still being put to the test very harshly today. And in point of fact, to the present date, every electoral appointment has registered some blurred interpretations that did not make it possible to voice popular will. So a person is elected and the winner is another one eventually. Nonetheless, also at that time, the Church wanted to protect the common grounds, the common goods, and wanted to guarantee that the institution will be holding their position to continue to look at the future. And this was the objective of the agreements of 31st of December 2016, that once again made it possible to go through a peaceful transition and a peaceful passage of power within the framework of the state in our country. Now, let us consider what we can say about the democratic ideal within the framework of the Catholic Church. At this point, we might wonder why the Catholic Church, a religious institution and not a political one, shouldered the burden of all these actions in my country. I believe that the teaching of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church makes it possible to discover a certain form of democracy within the framework of the Church itself, and also some true challenges in the real notion of authority. At the basis of a similar approach, we find the etymologies of the word church that often is just considered as a hierarchy, but there are many democracies within the framework of the church itself. The word church, église, comes from ekklesia, ancient Greek, which means assembly.
La désignation de la communauté des disciples du Christ.
So the designation of Christ's disciples' community as church for a very long time was based on the functioning of old people's assemblies that used to exercise the right of democracy in state cities in ancient Greece. And it is also in the light of this notion, of this meaning of the word, that the second phase of the Church Synod is going to be about synodal church. That is to say, an assembly that walks together, that listens and gives voice to every single human being. This reference to the Greek origin of the word ecclesia, church, shows that democracy is not a modern invention by any means, and not even a creation of the project of globalization, but instead it has very, very ancient roots that the Bible does not ignore. In particular, the problem of the relationship between sound institutions, strong men, is part of the Bible as well. And in the Coelet's book, at chapter 9:13, you can read, and I'm quoting, this is a quote, and this other example of wisdom is something I've seen under the sun, and it is very serious. There was a small city with few inhabitants. A big king moved against it, sieged it, and built big fortification against it. But there was a poor man, but a wise one, which rescued and saved the city with his wisdom. Yet nobody afterwards remembers about this poor man. And so I'm saying wisdom is better than strength, knowledge is better than strength. But the wisdom of the poor is not taken stock of, and its words are never listened to. The peaceful words of people who are wise can be listened better than the cries of a commander of an army. And wisdom is more important than wars, important than weapons, but a single mistake can destroy a huge good thing. Today, we prefer to listen and follow the screams of crazy commandeers, and we do not listen to the wise words of the wise. So these people are believed more than the others, more than the wise. So it would be better to listen to the peaceful words of the wise, as we said, and the challenge of democracy in our times lies precisely in this, that is to say, making it possible for the voice of voiceless people be heard, the voice of a poor but wise person be heard, in order for it to be heard and have a value, take on a value. And until there will be this possibility, there will also be a possibility, until we have this listening perspective, so the small people, the wise people who are not making noise, so until there is this possibility, the whole world can be rescued. And this is why we really need to imagine, to invent a new way of living in a democratic state. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Cardinal Fridolin for what he told us and shared with us, because, by the way, he reminded us that democracy has deep roots in African culture, and therefore it's not true that talking about democracy means imposing Western values outside the Western world, because there are deep roots. The deep roots in democracy can be found in Africa as well. Also in the Christian tradition, in the Bible, and nowadays the Catholic Church of his country is really committed to foster strong institutions that are needed for the common good. Thank you very much for these very important and meaningful words. Let me hand it over to Professor and friend Marc Lazare, who is very well known in our country, in Paris, but in our country too, in Italy, I mean, because for a long time he's been also teaching in Italy as well. Thank you, Agostino, and I would like to thank Sant'Egidio for inviting me to talk about such a meaningful topic. The Cardinal said many things, but he also said that democracy is stepping back everywhere, is losing ground everywhere in the world, and that is true. There are so many things that confirm this statement. Every year, a weekly magazine, The Economist, publishes a survey to show democracies worldwide. Last year, in 2023, the weekly magazine showed that less than half of the world population enjoyed a democratic regime, and less than 8% are living in real democracies, as we could say, with a thorough democracy, a full democracy. It's only 8% of people, and he's right, the Cardinal is right when he said those things. Let me add something to what the Cardinal said. Let me tell you something about Europe. Why do I want to talk about Europe? Because in Europe, democracy, ever since the 90s, ever since the beginning of this millennium, has been going through a very dramatic situation. And there are words that are often used, such as crisis, democratic crisis, democracy being tired and fatigued somehow. And a historian has has to really follow through when he starts studying and analyzing. And I would like to try and do that, especially talking about young people. Democracy seems to be something normal, quote unquote. And but in Europe, it took a long time to build democracy, and democracies in Europe, it's not the first time that they are somehow that have to come to grips with fatigue, with crisis. Let me give you an example. Today, we can make a comparison with the 30s. In the 30s, democracy in France, for instance, in the 30s, was threatened. It was threatened by three types of what Agostino Giovannioli called the political religions. It was communism. At the time, they wanted to establish the proletarians' dictatorship, and then fascism, and then from 1922 in Europe, and Nazism started in 1933. So it's not the first time that this happens, but it's also true that the situation we know as it is now, it's a worrying situation because Agostino Giovannioli mentioned that democracy is under attack, both from inside and from outside. From outside, that's clear. Russia, China, they've commonly stated that we were no longer going through a time of democratic regimes. It's written black on white, and it's a huge challenge. Those regimes are presenting themselves as model regimes, and sometimes they are copied by others in other continents, and they could be copied by people who are who follow them within Europe, especially through technology, this technology and transformation wave. This is something we have been going through. Think of social media, for instance, and that really changes things and changes this idea of threat coming from within and from outside. Because in Europe, within Europe, there's a situation where we have a lot of question marks about democracy, and this is something we've always perceived throughout Europe. Think of January the 6th, 2021. Remember what happened in the States, in this country that we present as a model democracy, and one of the most, the one that has the largest background, that is one of the most ancient democracies, that has the longest tradition. And the supporters of Donald Trump attacked the Capitol Hill, and therefore, and yet Donald Trump is still a candidate and could even win the elections in next November, and that will have direct repercussions on our continent, on Europe, and so it's a worrying situation. So, how is democracy in Europe? How healthy is democracy in Europe and in the Western world at large? Of course, I don't want to talk about all democracies, but we at our university, we kind of do a democracy barometer. We try and interview European citizens to see what their perceptions are about democracy. And this year, we run a lab, Civipof, and it's a research center of Sciences Po, and they led a survey involving France, Italy, Germany, and Poland, 4 different countries, and 3 countries that were founding countries for Europe, Italy, France, and Germany, and then there was Poland that has joined Europe more recently. After World War II, after 40 years of communist dictatorship. They have joined Europe. They are different countries. They have a different history. They rely on different types of institutions. But there's a convergence among these four countries. And these four countries have the same perception. The citizens have the same perception. And it's mistrust, basically. These are societies that are characterized by mistrust. And it's a very marked form of mistrust. All policies, all countries, and the way citizens perceive policies, and the feeling they have is that they are corrupted democracies, looking after only their own interests, far away from the real issues citizens live in their day-to-day life. So mistrust versus all governments, no matter what their political color is, and mistrust in parliaments in the different countries. We've just voted for the European Parliament, so mistrust vis-à-vis the European Parliament as well. For those who are interested in the data coming from this survey, you may actually read it, go and read it. But how can we somehow define this mistrust that characterizes the four countries I mentioned? But they are a testimony for all of Europe. So it's a political factor, according to me, first and foremost. Our politicians have to take up responsibility because, as a matter of fact, they are responsible for policies. And I don't want to talk about the latest evolutions of French politics now. But this political factor does have an impact. Political classes were not listening to citizens, and that explains two factors. Abstentions. People do not go and vote. I'm not saying you are guilty, you young people, I mean, but as a matter of fact, it's people, more mature people. It's not that I want to point my finger at you, but if you young people do not go and vote, if there's a lot of abstentionism, not just among young people, but also among the social brackets that are not so cultured, not so educated, who do not have a very high income. So these people, this electorate, does not somehow feel, they cannot identify with politicians, the current politicians. So what do we have? As a result, we have a mistrust and populism. This is the only explanation I can give. Of course, there's a social factor to be taken into account. In Europe, we're going through a moment in time where unemployment went down to 6%. Yes, it's still a lot, but a lot less than in the past. And yet, the labor market situation, we all know about it. And the bishop talked about inequalities, social inequalities, gender inequalities, generation inequality, and also geographical inequalities, the difference between citizens of a country and immigrants, for instance. And that these inequalities make us understand how big these issues are. Jobs are more and more temporary, especially for younger people and for women. And this is one of the factors that can be a reason for this mistrust. But there's an even more complex factor. I'll try and summarize it with just a few words. And it's a cultural factor. An identity factor, and this question mark, this questioning about what happens in our society. This is something we all talk about. There are many Italian friends. They say, are we from Tuscany, from Italy, from Europe? Are we French, European? What are we in this continent? And then another question in this highly diversified society. We are a continent of elderly people. We have a demographic decline that is very strong in Italy, Germany, you name it, and therefore an aging population. And more and more immigrants in our country, and we have to acknowledge the fact that we are societies that tend to reject immigrants, that tend to close up and reject immigrants, Islam, since the attacks, and people associate Islam with religion, and then immigrants are not just it's not just the flow of immigrants coming in, but it's just the crisis of integration models we have in Europe, or we had in Europe. The French one, which is not really a model, it's an exception. It's the French exception, maybe. Being laymen, of course, private initiatives. You may have your religion, but we are a lay state. And then diversities, differences. Two models are undergoing a crisis. All models. And we are excited, I'm using the word on purpose, excited about populism. And yes, we are excited by them. And then they turn against elites that consider to be the ruling class, that concern to be very much focusing on themselves. And they focus on two families that are national and populist as well. You have the domestic situation, the national focus. They turn to the people. The left-hand populists are a minority, especially in France, and then the national populists that are the prevailing ones, and they're right-wing, and they are really extremists, and they keep saying that everything is wrong, that it's all because of those who are holding power, it's because of the ruling class, it's because of immigrants are guilty, and Islam is responsible for that, and they present themselves as the country's saviors, starting from the very idea of people and of a nation. So their idea of a nation equals nationalism, extreme nationalism, aggressive nationalism, and not aggressive as it used to be in the past, but it's a nationalism that it's very much closed up in itself, wrapped around itself. And even those who were, sorry if I make reference to France as the Rassemblement National, they explain that if you have two nationalities, you're not really French, so you cannot enjoy some duties or functions, and therefore you introduce this gap between people in our own country, in our own people. So that means that our democracies, European democracies, are endangered, are threatened. Is it true? And this is a real question. And populist groups that are a phenomenon that's been going on for quite a few years, since the 80s and the 90s, depending on the country, and they impose their political agenda somehow and put all other parties, all other parties have to defend themselves, even those who try and focus on, for instance, topics and themes such as immigration. So I think that you have to be careful, and the survey, I'm telling you, the political barometer it's called, tells us that there is a danger, there is a threat in the four countries that I've mentioned. One poll out of two, 1/3 of Italians and Germans and French, and that brings us back to what I was saying before, makes us say that we need a more authoritarian regime. We need a strong personality in power who could work on the issues, could work at parliament level, could issue and pass new laws. So there's a risk, there's an attempt, there's a temptation towards authoritarianism. And some say it would even be better to have the army in power, or So there's this risk and threat on the one hand, but also something else that's emerging. It's a need. It's a need for democratic sharing, for being part in a democracy. We want to play a more active role. We want to vote every 4 or 5 years, but we are in a society where the level of education is higher, so we want to constantly interact with our politicians. So there's a kind of ambivalence or ambiguity that is now characterizing European democracies. And I'm not saying that to give us a little hope, but I'm saying that because it helps us understand the threats and challenges to address, cultural challenges and, for instance, challenges that we have to meet up to create a new Europe, open, full of solidarity. People do feel and share something with others. We're focusing on social issues, solving democratic issues through politicians setting an examples. You talked about Africa, I talked about Europe. We have to reinvent somehow new forms of democracy. Thank you very much. Shared democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Marc Lazar, for your extremely effective summary of the problems of democracy today, also in countries that have a long-standing democratic history. But there's one thing I'd like to underline about the things that you said. Your appeal, so to speak, your heartfelt appeal, especially vis-à-vis young people, because the reasons for malaise, for lack of interest are understandable. Yet, we have to find new paths together, as you said at the end, to find a stronger democracy with more participation, because the strength of democracy is something that we inject into democracy with the quality of our participation and with the quality of our interaction that lies at the very heart of democracy. Now, I'm very happy now to give the floor to Andrea Malaguti, who's the editor of an important Italian newspaper, La Stampa. And I would like to say a couple of words. First of all, I would like to speak in favor of La Stampa of newspapers, because we are living in an era of social media, yet newspapers still play a very important role in democracy. They used to have this in the past, but yet there's still today the place of debate that in other places you cannot really have. You don't have this on social media. And the second very important thing is that La Stampa, within the framework of the Italian landscape, so La Stampa as a newspaper, and Mr. Malaguti is editor-in-chief, I repeat, and La Stampa plays a very particular role. So it is defending democracy. This is my personal opinion as an Italian citizen. I'd say that this newspaper is brave in defending democracy, in tackling problems in a very clear and in-depth manner. And this is not common. This is not something widespread. Thank you very much for this, and I'm very happy to give you the floor. Andrea Malaguti. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Agostino. Thank you all. Thanks to the Comunità Sant'Egidio for this invitation. It is fantastic to see so many young people. Normally we have people concentrating on smartphones, and seeing them following such a complex conference such as this really makes me feel warm in my heart. Speaking after Professor Lazar is very complicated, because he has focused on very important points that I share, starting from the idea that democracy is not a destiny, it is a choice. Well, this sentiment, this statement, which seems banal, I'm 59 years old. For people of my age, this always seems something useless, because people in my generation always thought that peace and democracy was something that were part and parcel of our existence. We didn't even consider a different situation. Then many things happened. First of all, there was this sentimental break in the trust, which is the main problem that we're facing in the relationship with institutions. I completely agree with what Cardinal was saying. We need strong institutions and not strong men. But the point was that at a certain point, people stopped relying upon institutions and trusting institutions. And in part, they were right. In 2008, there's been a huge crisis, and this crisis brought about a fracture that widened the gap between the very rich and the very poor. Whereas until 2008, imagining to give our children a better future than ours was taken for granted. From that year afterwards, it was much more complicated. And then the political world was unable to see this gap that was widened, and the left was unable to see this more than anything. I'm talking about Italy in this moment, and Professor Marc Lazar. Sorry, I was told to speak more slowly. Thank you, and sorry. And I was saying that Italy has lived this problem in a very, very clear manner. So what happened in Italy? There were 3 elections in the last 12-year period. And in these 3 elections, this is what happened. The first election, the Cinque Stelle movement won. What was this movement? This movement, Cinque Stelle, was saying that institutions are rotten. Thus, what happens? We step into the palace, we open it as if it were a tin of meat, so we open up the power and make the revolution. And of course, this is not what happened. It goes without saying. Afterwards, immediately afterwards, there were some elections. And in the following elections, while the electoral basis was narrowing, so there was a further reduction in the trust of people in the institutions, the following elections were won by Lega Lombarda. So the people who went to vote started to shift towards the right. And what does Lega said? Well, what Movimento 5 Stelle didn't do, we are going to do. We are going to destroy, dismantle these rotten institutions, starting from the European ones, starting from Brussels. Did they manage to? Of course not. So the electoral base still narrowing, and Italian people even shifted further to the right. And so, for the first time, they bring to the presidency a party that didn't even participate in the drafting of the constitutional charter, which is Fratelli d'Italia, which is the current, which is led by Giorgia Meloni, so the current leader in Italy, so the premier. So, if this is the projection, what we can expect in the next election is to have a general winning called Roberto Vannacci, and these latest European institutions, he presented himself for the first time, and he got 580,000 votes, which in percentage terms makes him the most voted man in Italy in this moment. So this Mr. Vannacci, this general, is so much right-wing that even the patriots, so the most right-wing group that we have in the European Parliament, decided to remove to remove the appointment as vice president, as deputy president. And the question we should all be asking ourselves in this moment, especially the left, is the following. Why is there such a huge number of people voting increasingly right, to the right, and instead of strong institutions, they prefer strong people? Because obviously there are not strong institutions, there are not strong ideas. And this, in my opinion, depends on 2 circumstances. The first is the following. In the last 4 years, three things happened that questioned our shared values. I'm talking about the values of Western societies, in particular of European cultures. Which were these three things? And there was a sequence of these three things. The first one was the COVID, so the pandemic. Apart from the impact on the psychological life of all of us, it changed all of our interactions. The pandemic brought about, created a huge gap between those who believe in science and those who don't believe in science, the so-called no-vax, those who believe that science is helping us live better and those who think that indeed science is a gigantic speculation in the hands of few people that make money on our skin. And this is a very significant separation. The second huge gap that widened was happened in 2022 when Russia started the war with Ukraine. Immediately there was, the public was split. So those in favor of Putin, in favor of NATO. And in Italy, this is a particularly complex problem because, and this is a debate perhaps we have not elaborated very strongly, many people think that the Americans at the end of the Second World War have not freed us, they're not liberated us, but they occupied us. And this story between, Russia and Ukraine, this war, brought up this division that seemed to be in the ground, and then the 7th of October, when there was the Hamas attack in Israel, and when the response, I don't know how to define it. So when Netanyahu produced, I don't know how to explain this, 50,000 victims in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, creates a further gap, a widening of the gap between people in favor of Palestinians and in favor of Israel. So we were coming through a moment where there was no trust in institutions. We're going through 3 periods where we have to wonder, we as Europeans, as people from the West, where are we standing? Because until very little time ago, when I was speaking with people close to me, I always had the impression to have some implicit things that were shared. So I was speaking with friends, with colleagues, with the people I was meeting at the bar, in the street, and more or less, yes, we had different opinions, but still we were talking about the same vision of the world that was shared. Now I had the feeling that this vision of the world is not for sharing anymore. We have not shared this. And this being said, it is difficult not to see that the peace of this 80-year period was the result of the creation of the European Union, because if you take the map of Europe 100 years ago and you compare it with now, you compare the tensions existing 100 years ago and the lack of tension that has been the lack of tension that existed so far, you understand what is the difference between being united and not united. What is happening is that we're going back to a situation where, in 2008, it's as if everyone was saying we can no longer accept that there is many people in the world that become rich to the detriment of all the others. Sorry, I'm speaking very quickly. I apologize again. And we cannot accept this. But the deglobalization brought about a comeback of wars. It brought wars back. So globalization created a distance between wealth, and deglobalization brings about wars. And talking about Western values, I can tell you that the only time since the beginning of the Ukrainian war, the UK and US Air Force planes started to work was when the UT tried to prevent the passage of the ships in the Red Sea. So the only value that the Western world recognizes itself in this moment is the circulation of goods and people. And it goes without saying that what is missing is a whole cultural and political basis supporting all this. Can we find this somewhere? I doubt it, because, you know, a few years ago I was in Italy, close to the Como Lake, Lake Como in Chernobyl, where there was a very important conference. We had Professor Lazar almost among them, and Viktor Orban took part in this conference. Now, Viktor Orban is a very determined person, very resolved, with ideas that are very creepy, I would say, very eerie, and I was very much struck by it, because while we try to talk about integration, peace, justice, social state, and so on, let's try to maintain the structure that made it possible for us to grow so far. Viktor Orban said, and I quote, "For me, there is no type of European politics. I am against Eurobonds. I have no intention whatsoever of accepting immigration in my country. The maximum that I can do is to see whether there are some secondary advantages in the single market." And it goes without saying that with this principle, with the veto right that exists in Europe, either we get to some form of strengthened cooperation among a series of countries deciding to be together to overcome the problems apart from beyond the veto right, or we're not going anywhere. So the main problem is a crisis in terms of trust, and this goes it goes hand in hand with a lack of clarity. Why am I saying this? Because the premier, Italian premier, is in New York, and he's meeting Elon Musk, and he was, we said before what he did in 2021 in Capitol Hill along with Trump. So I put them together because now they're working together, we can say, the two. But what is the point? Giorgia Meloni, the Italian premier, up to a few days ago, she told us that she's totally in favor, supporting Ursula von der Leyen, very close to the economic vision of Mario Draghi, and then she gets on a plane and she's going to hug Elon Musk. I mean, if I were an elector of her, I would be quite confused, vaguely confused. I have no idea of what the economic recipe and the vision of the world that she has. But this does not apply only to her in Italy. It also applies to the whole left, because about the voting in Ukraine, it was split with 7 different positions. So faced with this confusion, it is difficult to imagine a path to follow. The second problem, the second part of the problems that Europe is and the Western world is facing in this moment is related to a particular crisis that is going around, getting mixed with other people, and since the moment that the social media arrived, the discourse, as we say, as we name it, is narrowing more and more, because social media are press agency of the ego, some people say, but they certainly are a mechanism through which the public discourse is cancelled, is swept away. Everyone expresses his or her own opinion, and that position, regardless of all the others, which is the contra of democracy, to be clear, because democracy is finding a common point among different opinions that have to circulate, because this is the only way to grow. Social media have a mechanism which is the opposite. That is to say, every single person lives within his or her own bubble, and it does so by choice, and also because, perhaps this discourse is not in Europe, but social media in this moment are in the hands of 7 human beings in the whole planet. So these are 7 human beings. They're all in the United States. So we have 7 big companies in the world that, in California, basically, not the world, that control the data of billions of people. And they know everything about our sexual orientation, the preference. They know everything about our political preference. They know everything about what we eat, or where we travel, where we go, the friends we have. And this may be considered a form of voyeurism difficult to cope with. But the problem is that this is called the capitalism of surveillance. So the moment we think we have maximum freedom, in point of fact, we have the maximum control. All right, I'm almost finished. So every one of us, I'd like to close on this note. We must be aware of this because democracy is a choice. It's not a destiny. Thank you very much, and sorry for being so long, and thank you for bearing with me. Thank you.
I do apologize to Andrea Malaguti because what he was saying was very interesting and I abruptly cut him short. But we'd like to keep these presentations short so as to be able to have a Q&A session and allow people to ask questions. It's interesting to see what the editor of La Stampa Daily told us in just a few minutes. Two of them could be that the destiny of democracy cannot be separated from what is happening in the world, from globalization. Globalization was indeed a turning point for democracy too. And then there's another big issue of not having a shared vision, not having a shared and a common. And as he said, democracy is reaching an agreement, respecting everyone's opinion, but reaching an agreement. This is something we do not have unless you have a shared opinion, unless you can somehow compare your opinion against others and then maybe converged on a common or shared view. I'm not going to steal any more time. I'm very, very happy to give the floor to Mahamat Saleh Nadif, who will give a contribution as Foreign Minister of Foreign Affairs of Chad. And therefore, he has a long-standing experience in international relations. You have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le modérateur. Je m'excuse auprès de la salle, j'ai un petit problème de mobilité, donc je me permets de rester sur place. Avant de commencer mon propos, j'aimerais d'abord remercier les responsables de Sant'Egidio pour m'avoir invité à cette importante rencontre. En effet, pour moi, le thème...
I would like to thank you very much. And democracy, it's Mahamat Saleh Nadif, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Chad, speaking. Indeed, democracy is of utmost importance in this road we are following together, this pathway we're following together towards peace. I wouldn't say democracy to the test, but I would rather say the practice of democracy put to test or under testing. There are ideas that are expressed, and I'll talk about Africa first and foremost. And recently there was a survey, the African Barometer on Democracy. And there were 33 countries involved in the survey, African countries, and 65% of Africans aspire to democracy. Well, 66% of Africans are against coup d'etat, and 80% of Africans, always according to this survey, rejects regimes that are in the hands of a strong leader, and then 60% reject regimes with a single party, led by a single party. And according to the outcome of this survey, this African barometer or something, they're saying that the quality of elections is ever declining, and there's more and more corruption, and there's an inability by the ruling class to promote the so-called rightful state. These are the worries expressed by Africans. That's why I say, instead of saying democracy to the test, we should say the practice of democracy to the test. Because if I look at this from the African perspective, I would like to say that there is no separation among the three types of power, executive, lawmaking, and judicial. And I would like to talk about the judicial power, the third component in the triad. It's those who are organizing elections, unlike Europe, where you have the Ministry of Internal Affairs, you have independent commissions organizing elections. Here instead, in Africa instead, it's important to understand what kind of institution should organize elections, of agency or entity should organize elections, what kind of freedom they have. And then we should have a judge proclaiming the elections outcome and answering possible questions, at least in Africa. Based on my personal experience, I will say that one of the greatest issues is the lack of independence of the judiciary power. It's not so easy, and when you look at Africa, and imagine the map of Africa, conjure it up, and when we look at Africa, we realize that wherever the independence of the judiciary is not available, when there's less independence, as I was saying, well, we have it a lot more in French-speaking countries. I know that you will be probably surprised by that, but this is Africa's evolution. This is how things are. I can give you a lot of examples in that respect. And for instance, if you think of what happened 4 or 5 years ago in Malawi, where the outcome of elections was affected by the judiciary because they challenged those results, and then there were new elections held. Even recently in Kenya, the president wanted to change some articles of the constitution, and the judiciary rejected that, challenged that. So as to the French-speaking countries, I have 2 or 3 examples I can give you. You've all followed what happened in Senegal, and Senegal is one of the models, political models that have somehow made it, if I may say so. It may sound paradoxical, but the 3 countries of Central Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, who are ruled by military regimes, those 3 countries were countries where elections were running smoothly somehow, but But then, of course, all of a sudden, it's not because elections were run smoothly or you can then have somehow behave in a totally different way from what the population, from what the people are expecting. And again, elections were well made. I follow them very closely, personally. But then it's the practice of democracy that is very full of flaws and led to the coup. And unfortunately, this is the situation in Africa, in some countries. So if I take Africa as an example and I ask a question, we have eminent professors here, we have legal experts, and I would like to ask a question. Why our judicial systems, our legal systems, why are they more independent versus governments or in English-speaking countries? Can you answer that question? Because that would help me a lot to have a better grasp of the situation. Because in 2021, there were supposed to be elections in Nigeria. And so I left to go and see. I went there to go and see, to monitor what was happening. Because there's always fear of a post-election crisis. So I went there, met the opposition parties, I met women, civil opposition, young people, even those who were in power. And the conclusion we got to, because there was a group of us there, the conclusion we drew was that they were all telling us, despite your worries, we are confident that the Commission, we trust in the Commission, that is the entity that was due to organize in Nigeria. In Nigeria, they do have a tradition where the person in charge of organizing the election has to be somebody from the academia with no political mandates, or better said, they are prevented from taking up a political mandate. So they are just somebody from the academia. So they said, we trust both the entity that organizes the elections and this person in charge. We trust our judicial system. If going forward, if they state something, we respect that. We abide by that. If something wrong comes out, we may then sue, or that is also true for Gambia, for other English-speaking countries, as I said before. There's a difference between English-speaking and French-speaking countries. Because why are French-speaking countries an exception? Because many of our legal experts studied in France. Professor, I listened to your contribution carefully and with a lot of attention, but rest assured that we do still have shared values, even in Africa. Democracy is a shared value. Africans want democracy, but in practice we need to learn how to get there. African citizens want to vote, want to express their opinions, and they want their vote to be respected. That's what they are asking. Otherwise, it's all political talk. Otherwise, that's it. But if you have questions, I'll be ready to answer them. But rest assured that Africans do love democracy. This is what I wanted to tell you.
Molte grazie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saleh Nadif, and thank you very much to you. And with his diplomatic experience, very profound, he concentrated on a very interesting issue. Men and women in Africa want democracy, but the problem often is the practice of democracy. And at this point, at this level, we have the strong institutions that come into play, and then we have the balance among the various powers. And these are apparently technical aspects, but they're not, because they influence so much the livelihood, the practice of democracy. Thank you very much again for your contribution. Now I'm going to give the floor to Professor Donatella Di Cesare. He's a full professor of theoretical philosophy at the Sapienza University in Rome, Italy, and she's a student of philosophy and also political philosophy. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's always an honor and a joy being with our friends in Sant'Egidio. And I very much feel at home with you, I had to say this. Democracy on trial, democracy to the test. I heard many different ideas, many suggestions, and I hope there will be an opportunity to go back to this in the debate. As the ambassador was saying previously, it is not democracy which is to the test, but it is democratic practice. But instead, I think that it is democracy which is being put to the test. And actually, there are various tests that democracy is currently subject to. I would like to say that just this. We are living in an era of demos without kratos, so people without power. Just to say one thing, but there are many drifts. And today I have chosen to talk about one particular drift, which I'm very interested in, very close to my heart, and I have insisted quite a lot in the recent months. I really try to do so. So demos is not ethnos, and democracy is not an ethnocracy. The issue of what people, the population is very complex, and it is the very theme of the philosophical debate. So it is difficult to give a definition to what people means. But what is certain is that the reduction, so bringing down the people to its supposed ethnic boundaries, is now the key word that sovereignists are using, and this in Europe, in America, and a little bit everywhere in the world. It is only through this, bringing it down, this reduction, you can explain the new nationalisms. I'm talking about new nationalism in its extreme forms of aggression, from the current war conflicts to the demographic engineering plans, from the nation-states war against migrants to the need to pursue ethnic cleansing, or even to curb a so-called ethnic replacement of European peoples. But is ethnos really synonymous with demos? So these two Greek words are confused. This is the question. And does the primacy of ethnicity fit with democracy? Well, to answer this question, I would like to go back to the first text in which the Greek word demokratia occurs. And which is this text? It is a tragedy by Aeschylus. It's a beautiful tragedy, which is called in Italian the supplici, the supplices in English, but we could also call this migrants or asylum seekers. So we are talking about protagonists, which are women fleeing family violence, migrants, having set sail from the North African coast. They end up in Argos. And they stop on the beach before asking for asylum, and they think they must turn to a king. But no, they don't know the big novelty. Which is this novelty? That there is a new political form in Argos, that is to say, democracy. So demos, the people decide. and so people will decide. And I think that what the description of this scene by Aeschylus is really, it really embodies democracy, because he talks about the assembly of people and asked how the victorious hand of how did the mighty hand of the people vote? Democratus vote, and the hand rises to vote, which is this gesture for the first time, and it is the first time that democracy manifests itself. And those hands that rise are the welcoming hands, and they vote for the reception of migrant women. It is a revolt of women, of asylum seekers, that brings, for the first time, democracy to the fore. And on the other hand, democracy is realized by welcoming. So there is no democracy without hospitality. There is no hospitality without democracy. And it is precisely welcoming hospitality that is the litmus test, the proof of the inbuilt openness in the demos, in the people, which can never close in, they can never retreat. But the danger of closure comes to light very early on, and while the most advanced laws show this, so we see this already in ancient Athens, and while the citizens for resident foreigners is recognized, at the same time, very soon, the criterion of descent is the law of birth and blood. So and this gains ground. So the law of birth and blood, the principle of the soil, the myth, the powerful and terrible myth of autochthony. And all this comes to the fore. A citizen would only be the one who has a good origin, descended from autochthonous people who never contaminated or moved. So to them would therefore belong the land from which they were born. And so blood and soil that still feed the ethnos, because what we see is a continuous surfacing over the centuries of this, testing the very notion of democracy. In the 20th century, this drift is not even shifted by the teaching of the Torah and the Gospel, where, as we know, the extraordinary figure of resident foreigners surpasses and goes beyond that of citizens. Please allow me to say that democracy is not a modern invention. Democracy, rather the contrary, is written in the most important religious text, starting from the Torah. So this splendid figure of resident foreigners, which is then taken and relaunched in the Gospel. I don't know the Islamic text, I'm sorry about this. And I don't need to underline which was the result of reducing demos to ethnos during the National Socialism, which was remodeling biopolitical aspects, going to the point of systematically killing the people who would have tainted the German ethnicity. But the Italian fascism was no different, and it would be a mistake to believe that blood and soil are phantoms or the past, or just ghosts of the past. This is a mistake, because today they are raging again, and I would like to remind this, after the election of Brandenburg, the terrible word of alternative to Deutschland, re-immigration. So foreigners and migrants are banished in the name of the supposed homogeneity of the inhabitants, children of their sons, brothers, which is a very trendy word, without sisters, and all belonging to the patrilineal progeny to the fatherland and its order. But democracy led to nationalization and also brought down to nation, to taking root in this so-called autochthonous origins is no longer democracy. It is ethnocracy, and it is one of the pathologies, the totalitarian pathologies of democracy. And this was being seen already by philosophers, for instance, Claude Lefort and politologists as well, and Hannah Arendt as well. And because people is a political form which is dynamic, that recomposes itself constantly. So it is not a familistic community based on natural authority, on the ties of blood and soil, and the loss, and this, I haven't heard this today, and I hope we're going to talk about this afterwards in the debate, the loss of the political bond, the loss of the political connection with people has led to the rise of an ethnic bond, which means myth of phantomatic purity and hatred, pure hatred, that is to say, war in all of its forms. And it is for this reason that today here, imagining peace, we must rethink those pages, extraordinary pages of Aeschylus about welcoming democracy and on democratic welcome. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Donatella Di Cesare, for this lecture. And if you allow me, so short and yet so profound and effective, so clear. Demos is not ethnos. People are not their nation, their ethnicity. So there's a deep connection between democracy and welcoming people, hosting people. This comes from very far away, but it's still very topical, very modern. Thanks for reminding us of religious roots in the Torah and the Gospel, where you find the roots of democracy as well. That is very important also for the connection, as I said, the connection we've been looking throughout the morning. The connection between religions and democracy. Let me now hand it over to Mr. Hamed Krishen, who is the principal presenter of Al Jazeera in Tunisia, and we'll be very pleased to listen to him. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you. Today, I would like to speak as a journalist and also as a citizen coming from the Arab world. The Arab world is light years away from democracy. We have to agree on that from the very beginning. We are light years away from democracy. The Arab world has always looked at Europe, at the US, as a model to look up to as far as democracy is concerned. That's why I would like to talk to you about the feeling we have now in the Arab world when it comes to democracy. What is the perception? How are we living it? How have we been living it for about 11 years, ever since the beginning of the Gaza war? we have to say that somehow we are disillusioned and about Western democracies. And as to the opinion they have of the Arab world. First of all, Western democracies, within Western democracies, Western democracies as they are in reality, and Western democracies as they behave vis-à-vis the international community, how they are viewed by the Arab public opinion that I follow every day as a journalist. When we talk about the disappointment at the level of Western democracies, what do I mean by that? I mean that freedoms and democratic freedom and values were put to test, were challenged during the Gaza war. And how was that? First of all, through the media. Mainstream media in English. And most media in the US and in the Western countries were not professional in the way they dealt with it. They were not balanced, they were not neutral, they were not fair, and they did not really look at what was happening in Gaza. They only saw that with one eye and not two. They were somehow taking parts, somehow they were going for someone's opinion rather than others. Many television channels in France and in Germany no longer have professional media. First of all, the freedom of expression. Any public figure expresses their human solidarity to Gaza, human solidarity to Palestinians, and human solidarity after the death of 40,000 people, 17,000 Palestinian kids either lost their mother or their father or both. 650,000 Palestinian kids, pupils, students, could no longer go back to school for the second year in a row. Whoever speaks about that in the Western world, they tell him or her, you're in favor of terrorism, we're not listening to you. And so also the freedom to protest. And we've seen protests. I'm not saying in favor of Palestinians, but at least in favor of the human tragedy that is taking place in Gaza. And in Germany, in the US, there were protests by the students in the UK, France, the US, and they were seen as people who wanted to raise chaos, to cause chaos. Yesterday, we saw 3 or 4 policemen who were chasing a 13-year-old kid because he was showing a Palestinian flag. It's very strange to see these in democracies that we normally see as models. It's very, very strange. So that is the point I would like to make within these democracies at global level. How do these democracies deal with human rights, the international law? Those are regimes that were set up after World War II to somehow stop the so-called law of the jungle and come up with international law. I'm not talking about history. the historical legitimacy of Palestinians or religious legitimacy of Palestinians. I'm talking about international law, the right of people to self-determination, the right of people not to live under siege somehow. The Palestinians, starting from 1967, they've been living under siege practically in Gaza and Cisjordan. The international law, it's not applied there. It's applied in Ukraine, it's applied elsewhere, but it's not, when it comes to Palestinians and our Arab region, it's not applied. This is what they say. UN resolutions are not applied. The international courts of justice are not taking action, or they reject challenges or resorting to those courts. There's no criminal law courts that accept these suits or challenges. One of the courts were called, the international or global criminal law was made for criminals in Africa and in the third world. This is what it was made for. It was not, this court was not made to rule against us. This person was said exactly that. Major leaders said that. And many leaders were put under pressure to somehow revoke or cancel the order that was sent to put some Israelis in jail. So ever since the beginning, the Arab public opinion is aware that we are not in a democracy. We live under oppressive regimes in the Arab world, so we do not have the right to somehow teach something to the Western world. But the Western world, who used to be our example for democracy, has failed when it comes to Gaza. During the opening of Sant'Egidio yesterday, of the Sant'Egidio event, we did not hear much about Gaza, just by chance or very, very along the lines. The President Emmanuel Macron spoke 2 or 3 times, maybe on October the 7th, and he did not talk about the Gaza tragedy. He did not talk about the kids who were killed. 3/4 of people killed are women or kids, and that was not important for him. He spoke 2 or 3 times about October the 7th. Hamid Malouf, the permanent secretary of the French Academia, talked about artificial intelligence. I'm not saying that he didn't speak about Gaza. He didn't even speak about Lebanon, as if Lebanon is not suffering from anything or is not being impacted by anything. We in the Arab world thought that we were faced with a Western world model, a democracy model that we had to follow. But we feel that these democracies are pushing us back to the law of the jungle, the law of the strongest, the law of strength, and not the law of based on law. And this is a big disappointment. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind words. And they recall the word responsibility, accountability, that we Europeans and we people living in the Western world, this is something we have vis-a-vis the entire world. The world is looking upon us. And while, here democracy has deep roots, and so we Westerners are expected to come up with models, setting examples when it comes to democracy. And this is something it's a positive expectation other people have vis-à-vis Europeans and Westerners. But it also tells us that we can do more. Having said that, I would like to thank our speaker from Al Jazeera for criticizing the opening meeting of the Sant'Egidio event, because this is democracy. It shows that we love talking to people, having somehow an exchange. And that is the very essence of democracy. I think that in many presentations yesterday, there were deep worries about what is happening in Gaza. The Archbishop of Canterbury expressed that, but I think it was mentioned in almost all the contributions, but that's my personal opinion, of course. Thank you very much for your contribution. Let's now hand it over to the last but not least, of course, speaker, Zaid Mohammed Bar al-Hulum, who is the director of the Al-Kai Institute in Iraq. And I ask him to take the floor. Thank you very much.
قولة العرب مسك الختام. السيدات والسادة الكرام.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I would like to turn to you, peaceful welcome. May the peace of Allah be with you. Good morning. I am happy to be here among you in this forum that brings together an elite of students, researchers, to try and give an intellectual contribution to the advancement of progress in the various cultural frameworks and a contribution to try and build a better future for the next generations through a strengthened cooperation in building our societies. In all the initiatives, all the actions that we are taking, wherever they are implemented, we try with the various partners we're involved with to be positive, to have a positive approach all the time, consistently. So it is not a secret, you know very well that democracy has a strong impact on stability and prosperity in the various countries. But this prosperity at all levels as we know very well, as I said, democracy has a strong impact on prosperity, and I am thus convinced that we have been talking about democracy enough. So at this point, I'll try to concentrate on democracy in Iraq, trying to give you a snapshot of the reality that we are currently living in Iraq, so in this contemporary period. So I will be talking about the experience of democracy in Iraq. There are 3 points in my speech. First of all, the Iraqi approach to democracy, which are the modalities to implement this, and 3, last rhetorical question, do we need democracy? Since the very birth of the modern Iraqi state, democracy has never been present in the contemporary notion of the thing. Those who know the political history of modern Iraq will not find any evidence or the minimum presence of democratic practices based on the standards we heard so far. So we have been having various regimes, totalitarian regimes, authoritarian regimes and dictatorships. Democracy was just, some kind of formal novelty, and only that appeared only after international pressures, or pressures on the part of the international community. After the change that occurred in 2003, that started with the fall of the repressive regime, there was a strong need of creating a new system based on the true democratic criteria and parameters. The fall of the regime, of the dictatorship, the occupation of Iraq on the part of the United States, that was followed by a dissolution of state institutions and the army, brought about chaos in the country. So we had to start from scratch to establish a new system. Iraq is a pluralistic country where Muslim people account for the majority. Shiites have the majority among Muslims, and it is evident to see that the most important factor is the religious institution, so the maximum authority of Shiite community all over the world, which is found in Najaf, represented by the Imam Sayyid al-Sistani. This supreme authority considers that Iraq is a plural system in terms of religion and also in terms of ethnicity. And this supreme authority, the Shiite authority, thinks that the country must be managed based on cooperation. And this supreme Shiite authority could have said, we are the majority, so the majority governs. Being present and strong at a show level, it would have been easy to do that. It would have been easy for the majority to govern, controlling the administration of the country, imposing what it wants. But the supreme authority, so the Marjahia, decided to be some sort of canopy on the head of all Iraqi people, defending everyone's rights. So it asks everyone to take part in the administration of the country, asking everyone to contribute to the election, the choice of governmental representatives. So there were elections organized, and it was possible for people to choose their representatives in parliament, whose task would be to draw up the fundamental law, the constitution. Various things happened afterwards. Elections took place, and what we are seeing is some sort of a gradual maturity on the part of the electors in Iraq. There are various challenges before us, but the main one is that Iraq is a novel country, so to speak. So it's new to this process, and so it calls for some time to mature in order for this process to be shaped up. So it used to be a dictatorship, and now we are turning into democracy, and this cannot happen overnight. So this position on the part of the Shiite religious world does not come from nothing. It is drawing inspiration from the biography of the Prophet, because the biography itself of Muhammad, the Prophet, tells us that already 14 centuries ago, democracy was implemented by the Prophet, and the Quran says there's no constriction in religion. And so this is what happened already in the early days. Those who know the Medina Charter, which was the charter based on which the city of Medina was gathered. Medina had both Muslim and Christian and Jewish inhabitants. So the Prophet established the following. So a document which is known as the Medina document to govern the city. Well, from that time, Islam has been respecting the various ethnicities, the various ethnical groups, and this continues. And this tradition has been uninterrupted up until the supreme authority in Iraq. So this democracy has a religious base, a humanistic base, which is inbuilt in our tradition, and it is represented by the supreme authority. Clearly, this has an impact. We have problems in implementing this process. We have some delays as well. And at this point, I'd like to give some recommendations. I don't want to dwell too much upon this, so we'll concentrate on some recommendations. We have to do more to enhance the awareness of society vis-à-vis democracy. Then we have to make sure that the respect of state institutions exists, and teach the respect for executive and legislative powers, and take advantage of other experiences of the pioneers of democracies, and eventually cast light on intellectual codes and texts. And eventually we have to avoid double parameters, so to speak. At the end of this meeting, I would like to underline the importance of Sant'Egidio's initiative to build a more peaceful and tolerable world. I hope that this symposium is going to continue in the future very fruitfully to enhance maximum cooperation among all cultures and religions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your words. And you said, and rightly so, that democracy has to be built. In Iraq, we are at the beginning of this process, but it's very important to see that the maximum religious authority in Iraq saying there's pluralism in Iraq from a religious and ethnic viewpoint, so they are laying the foundations for democracy. It will take time, it'll need patience, it'll need help. We have to help each other among people, but I think we'll listen to very wise words. We went beyond the allotted time frame, but we are very happy because we listened to very interesting insights. If there are questions, we will be very happy to take them briefly, because we don't have much time, but then we will give the floor to our speakers. One question, please, into the mic, otherwise we won't be able to translate it.
Assalamu alaikum, Sayyid Dibaji.
May the peace be with you. This is Mr. Ibaji from Kuwait, Secretary General of the International Organization of the Islamic judiciaries. Thank you very much for your beautiful words. And